Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Today, is a debt jubilee really the best way of ridding the world of near stagnant growth? Would a reset revitalise the economies of the world? And how do we stop ourselves getting into this situation again? Is the wealth divide part of this problem? And could we fix that with a universal basic income? Is this a possible roadmap for the future or just a reward for those who don't like to work? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Okay, well, Steve, we've talked a fair bit about the idea of a debt jubilee, and also we've talked a lot about the idea of a universal basic income as well. So let's look at the two together. Are they two different approaches for two different problems, or can they be combined? Are we also talking hypotheticals in all of this? Because I wonder whether in our lifetime, whether we'll ever see either of them come to light. But, you know, let's entertain the idea that we will. But can you cure the debt problem, for example, with a universal basic income? Probably not, because the people with debt have so much of it. A universal basic income is not going to solve that problem.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what you can say with universal basic income, it's a solution to the symptoms, some of the symptoms, but it's not a solution to the cause. Because if you look at the income distribution that existed back in the 50s and 60s, substantially more of GDP, and that was lower then, of course, went to workers than it goes to them now. There's been quite a dramatic decline in the share going to workers. And at the same time, partly to get over that terrible problem of no income, want to borrow money from a bank and get on a sure thing of rising house prices. So in the aftermath of that, in countries like America, of course, and the UK and elsewhere in the world, people are carrying levels of debt into their retirements they were never carrying before.
But isn't it largely the wealthy class that are doing that? They're the ones carrying the debt, and if we pay off their debts, they're just going to borrow more, aren't they? And there's also the question about if we pay off their debts, I mean, why are we doing that? You know, don't they deserve it?
Well, I think the distribution of debt compared to income is a lot different to the distribution of debt, absolutely. So you certainly have more of the debts carried by people who are wealthy, but the proportional, the impact of the debt you're carrying when you're poor, even if it's a lower debt compared to your income, it can be much more drastic. I highly recommend people to take a look at the work of Linda Tirado. I hope I'm pronouncing Linda's name properly. But Linda wrote a book called Hand to Mouth, which is an explanation of what life is like for her, or was like for her as a poor person in America. And one of the examples she gives is that one day she had a truck get impounded, and she wasn't able to pay the storage fee that they put on top to get it back out. Finally lost the truck, lost the job, and lost the flat she was in quick order. So, now she's carrying probably she couldn't get credit card debt, anything like what we would be used to, but at that level of income, it matters to have any debt whatsoever. Right. And of course, the UBI is more effective at that level. But I think you've still got people, there are plenty of people who are going into their retirements now who are carrying levels of mortgage debt they never expected to carry, are wondering how they're going to manage that at the same time as paying enough to live.
Right. That is because everything is now so much more expensive, particularly, our houses are so more expensive because we've got more access to debt. So it's become a sort of self-fulfilling spiral.
Positive feedback, yeah. And one thing which the element of my Minsky model, which I think I can say the real world has revealed it's got the same basic behaviour, is that the increase in the level of debt, even though it may be paid for, if you can say it's paid by capitalists when they borrow the money and so on, the income distribution income to that is to reduce the amount of money going to workers. So what you have is that the debt is causing a lower income share. So in that situation, if you gave a UBI, then you mask the symptom of that redistribution of income caused by the high level of private debt, but you don't address the cause.
Right. So one follows the other. We have the debt jubilee followed by universal basic income, which would help prevent the problem from emerging again. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying it's partly the way to go. I mean, I'm in favour of UBI. There are, of course, you'll see modern monetary theory is totally committed to the idea of a job guarantee, and saying that you get a job if you're out of work, then there's a job at a lower pay rate than the minimum wage, but above the poverty line, and then you get allocated to work which would normally be in social things or greening the planet, work of that nature. And they've got a strong emphasis. You have to be doing work to get the pay. The UBI, they treat as saying, well, that's being paid to do nothing. And my feeling about that
is rewarding sloth. I heard someone referring it to.
Yeah. Well, if you give people a UBI, you're paying them to do anything. This is the other side of it. Yes, I mean, if you look at the state of our culture today, then there may well be people who say, okay, that's a great way to just get income, sit back at home, watch YouTube, and not have to work for an income, and that's seen as a social negative. But if you take ourselves right back to our beginnings as a species, rather than the complicated society we've built now, your status in the social groups we used to live in depended in part on your contribution to everybody else. Somebody who was a slacker in that and just basically did nothing and expected to receive gifts from the others would ultimately be told to go and pick up your swag and go live on your own.
We can't really compare. I mean, we're sort of going off the debt thing, but let's just follow this line for the moment. But you can't really apply that, though, can you? Because in those days, everyone had to get involved because it was a question of survival. Whereas in this day and age, you can sit in your two-bedroom flat and watch YouTube and no one will know about it. And if the money's going in your bank, then everyone's blissfully unaware of how little you're doing.
But I would like to get to the stage where we try to rebuild what we had in terms of what suits our species, and that is where you work for the pleasure of work and for the pleasure of contributing to your community.
Yeah.
Which we've let it. That is part of why people do work. It's we are not an individual species. We're a species that gets its feedback from what we do collectively, and in that sense, that's partially why we can hire people to do work, because they then are transferring that attitude they've got for the community to the entity they work with. It's a corporation, the government, military, et cetera, et cetera. That's a large part of why we do stuff. It is not because we have to be paid to do it. There's a desire in us to contribute to a community, however we define the community. And what's happened, of course, that community has been defined as the company you work for, the government you work for, the military you work for these days, rather than the community you're part of.
It would be nice if everyone thought that way. I'm not sure everyone does. I think you might have a view of humanity that, well, anyway, we'll see. But let's go back to this idea of the debt jubilee first of all, because obviously the idea of that is if we're carrying so much debt, we are cutting back on our spending, and that has the potential to destroy the economy. But surely it is the average we want to deal with, because if you've got heavy debt, I mean, that is your lookout, isn't it? We don't want to eradicate their debt. It's because they're only going to have a marginal impact on total spending. It's the mass of the population that we're really concerned about. So
what the idea of my debt jubilee is I mean, there's all sorts of things that people have said. This won't work because of X, Y, and Z, and some of those are legitimate arguments. So if you go back to what debt jubilees used to be in the past, and this is where Michael Hudson's work and David Graeber's work is very important, it was a general forgiveness of household debt. The corporate debts, which were back in early Sumeria, the debts were measured in units of silver for commercial debts. They weren't affected. It was the debts only of the households. Now, the debts of the households often were actually run up not by actually taking out a loan and not being able to repay it, but by buying things on credit and not being able to pay for it later when the harvest failed. And, pardon me, mead halls and beer halls and stuff like that, often a large part of people actually ran up these debts. So it was a case of buying on credit, getting to the point where you're supposed to pay on credit, or pay for the credit, not being able to, and then your debt is declared, and you would potentially become a debt slave.
Which, of course, many people would say they are today. So would a debt jubilee fix that problem? And what about a universal basic income as well? We'll look at that in full in the full-length version of this podcast. If you want to hear that, you need to become a subscriber to Steve on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen. If you pledge $10 or more support each month, you'll get access to this and all the other podcasts in this series. Or you can become a subscriber at debunkingeconomics.com. Hopefully you'll do one of those two things, and we'll see you back here again for the full edition of this podcast. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening.